Welcome to Medic Life, a video podcast for EMS professionals with your host, John Newton.
Alrighty guys, so welcome to the second half. Again, I'm your host, John Newton, here at Medic Life. And again, we're hanging out with Dr. Adam Scioli, who is a licensed psychiatrist in Pennsylvania. So, I guess my question to start off this half for you, Doc, is why do you think PTSD is increasing? Why it's a big issue in EMS now, even more so?
Yeah, I don't think PTSD is actually increasing. I just think awareness of it is increasing, and I think it's a function of a lot of energy going into the destigmatization of mental health issues in general. And I think the fact of the matter is when people start dying in clusters, as you mentioned, the Chicago Fire Department had a series of suicides. People get tired of sitting around and not doing anything about it. And I think the culture has to change, and we're starting to recognize that we need to speak up about these horrific things that we're seeing and the impact that they have on our lives, and get into the solution. Avoidance clearly is not the solution. Avoidance actually is part of the problem. And the solution is actually coming together, talking about it, banding together in camaraderie, and pushing through it as a team. But I think the prevalence has not increased. I would say that it's probably pretty steady. Again, it comes out of the wartime literature, and this used to be called war neuroses and then shell shock and you name it. But PTSD is what we call it now, but it's the same phenomenon that we've had since pre-World War I, 1900s, that we first started talking about this.
I almost hate to ask this question, but do you think it's, with all of the things that's going on and we see in the news, do you think this is really a good application to, well, I hate to say this, but it's war in the streets. I mean, we're actually seeing war in the streets here. Do you think that that's a good tell as to why maybe we have a little bit better understanding of what to look for, and why maybe we really are seeing it a little more or recognizing it a little more?
That's certainly a possibility. The truth is that we have not kept statistics on this until very recently. I believe Canada might have been the first to start keeping track of suicides within EMS, and then the Chicago Fire Department certainly keeps pretty solid statistics as well. But I don't have any good reason for why we're starting to see more of it, other than people are keeping track in general of mental health issues, more so than we were before. I mean, you have some pretty national figures, thankfully, coming out and sharing their stories, which makes it more likely for other people to share theirs.
So we've talked about some of the things we should look for: anger, aggression, the whole just wanting to kind of separate and not really interact. So I guess now the question is how do we approach our peers, our coworkers? What should we do, and how do we help them get the treatment they need? And, well, I think I have a follow-up with that, but I want to hear that answer first.
Yeah, I mean, the problem with PTSD is that the person who's suffering with it starts to develop this sort of global belief that they're not safe, the world's not safe. They start to either shut down, as we talked about before, or they become irritable, angry, and aggressive. So when you start seeing signs of that, it's time to pull your partner aside and say, hey, you have been affected by what we just went through as a team, and it's become quite obvious. And I care enough about you that I want you to pay attention to this and get some help. And I think one of the most effective strategies is getting them in touch with someone else who has gone through something similar.
Do you think it's a good idea for us to, if we see this person, this coworker who we've kind of broached the subject, we've said, okay, and this is what we've said to ourselves, they may not be receptive to me helping them. Do you think it's a good idea for us to approach management and go, look, Scott, Jeremy, Marty, whatever, they're having a bad day. It seems like there's some stuff going on. I really have tried to talk to them without coming out and just, kind of putting them on the spot. What can we do to help them? I mean, do you think that's really a good idea, or do you think this generates other problems?
Well, I think in the short term, it's easy to think about the other problems that it could generate, but I think the truth of the matter is that it's an appropriate intervention. It's our responsibility to look out for one another. I look at it as no different than approaching a colleague who has any other illness or condition. You're doing it from a place of concern, a place of love, and I think it's entirely appropriate to go to management. The delivery of the message is going to be important. In the past, as I said, the culture has been one of criticism, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, suck it up. That has to change. So presumably the people who are in leadership are in positions to squash that culture. If that's not the case, then it would certainly be harder for you to go to a supervisor that has a poor attitude toward the human condition, really, because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about normal emotional reactions that have overwhelmed someone's ability to cope.
So I read an article, and I don't want to pick on those guys from Canada, but it was actually specifically talking about a service in Canada. So a guy recently was fired by a service because he let them know that he had actually sought treatment for, and I believe it actually was for PTSD. How do we keep or make people feel a little more safe and secure in their job and go, look, if you seek treatment or if you get help or, I understand you have, and this is a big issue with EMS as well, especially if you're a paramedic. When we start talking about, you were talking earlier about substance and stuff like that, when we start talking about treatment for substance-related issues, that starts kind of making people look at you funny, and it kind of makes it hard for you to stay employed sometimes. So how do we get past that and make everybody, I guess, feel secure about it is okay to go ahead and get treatment and there will not be any repercussions from your job?
Yeah, I think what we have to recognize and be realistic about, we actually have to get realistic about the facts. And the facts are that people that are in this profession are exposed to a significant amount of stress, and they also have access to substances that others in society don't have access to. So that combination of stress and access is a potentially deadly mix. And for us to pretend that it doesn't happen is naive. The truth of the matter is that there's a Mental Health Parity Act that guarantees, a law that guarantees that people with mental illnesses and substance use disorders will be treated exactly in the same fashion as those with other chronic medical conditions such as heart disease and diabetes. And any organization that's not following that is in violation of the law. Of course, along with substance use and abuse, misuse, however you want to qualify it, dependence, oftentimes comes diversion of narcotics, diversion of other drugs, and the goal really is to get to the problem before it happens, before that starts to happen. Although there are cases where even when it gets to that level, people's jobs are able to be preserved if they're offered help, if they accept help, and if they get into recovery.
Well, cool. That I think that's an interesting perspective. I think that this is a conversation that we're going to have in EMS for a while. And I don't know that it's going to go away. I appreciate you talking to us tonight about PTSD. I would love to have you back to maybe talk about some other psych issues and hear your perspective. We could literally sit here for hours tonight, and I could just ask you question after question about psych stuff. Especially, I have you there on spot, but. I think from the as they say, the Reader's Digest version, it is. I think we've kind of boiled it down to the nuts and bolts of what we kind of need to look for, and maybe even some approaches that we can take. And I'm glad that you actually added in the whole legal aspect. A lot of times we don't think about the legal aspect and the protection that we have. Some people just sort of kind of throw up their hands and they're like, okay, well, you got me, and I'm going to try to go get another job, and maybe this doesn't, bite me in the butt, and maybe they don't find out, and here we go. So thanks for providing that. Do you have anything else that you would like to add in? Maybe just some final thoughts on PTSD in general in EMS, or maybe just some things that we could look for our patients. Since I kind of mentioned a little bit about the military, and we've seen a lot of folks coming back home, a lot of young guys.
Sure. I mean, if you want to talk about symptom clusters, there are really 4 basic symptom clusters, and the first one is that re-experiencing phenomenon, where the person who's gone through the traumatic event actually feels like he or she is re-experiencing the event over and over again. It becomes intrusive. That leads to avoidant behaviors. So, for instance, you might want to avoid the scene of the incident. If you witnessed a horrible event on Broad Street in Philadelphia, and the next time you and your partner are in the ambulance and your partner says to you, hang a right, let's avoid Broad Street, that might be something to look at. Why are we all of a sudden not going down Broad Street? Some of the negative cognitions that I talked about earlier, those false beliefs, I'm not safe, it's not a safe world, etc. And then hyper-arousal is another big one. So you might recognize someone who's really quick to startle. The classic Vietnam veteran who hears a helicopter go overhead and hits the deck. Those are the sort of things that you can get conditioned to really wanting to avoid, and conditioned to reacting to. For example, lights and sirens, gunshots, things of that nature, sights, sounds, and smells. These are all triggers that can put someone right back in the moment, even though it's not happening. So those are things you can look for in your colleagues. You can look for them in your patients. Some of the other things: depersonalization, derealization, sensing that the world is kind of in a dream sort of scape, or sensing that you're not even actually part of it. You're sort of floating above the situation and looking at it in an out-of-body sort of experience. Those are ways that the central nervous system protects the brain from trauma. And it's initially quite adaptive and later becomes significantly maladaptive. Leads to isolation and sometimes substance abuse, and, as we heard, suicide. But I'd love to come back, John, and each of these is separate subjects. I'd love to come back and focus on just substance use disorders in the workplace.
Yeah, substance use in the workplace and EMS is a problem. We hit a little bit and talked a little bit about the whole alcohol and how we have that culture, and like we said, some people do actually get into substance abuse, but there is a lot of psychosis that we don't even talk about. We barely touch in base education at EMS, and we do continuing education. It's a lot of peer-led type of education, and I think that we need to explore more of the psychiatric, what's that mental aspect to each one of these scenarios, whether it's like you were saying, substance abuse, or it's this maybe suicidal ideations, or even just this post-trauma patient, or even this patient who's had a really bad respiratory emergency, and we've got to figure out a way to calm them down and really kind of interact with them to make it a little more of a personal level. So I think these will be some fun discussions, and I look forward to having you back. And thanks for being here. For those of you
Thanks on Medic Life. This has been a treat. Thank you.